Ever since I was a little boy, I was fascinated by how things work. In fact, as I was growing up, we had a split level house, and down in the basement, I had found a nook underneath the stairs, and I had found an old table. I set that up, and I would gather all the broken things in our house. If somebody was going to throw an electronic device out because it didn't work anymore, I would grab that, and I would take it apart because I wanted to know, how does it work? What makes it tick? Can I fix it? 9 times out of 10, the answer was no. But I learned so incredibly much. I made things melt. I welded them together. I figured out things. But I was fascinated by how to build things, how to make things, how to structure things so that they worked. Now, fast forward a number of years, and now you can go online and you can watch a video about just about anything. You can learn how to do things, fix things, how to repair things around your house. You can learn how to build a house. But I don't know that I've ever watched a video that explained how to build a legacy. Now, the word legacy is weird because if we're honest, none of us want to talk about building a legacy. We don't like to talk about it because we recognize that to leave a legacy means that we have to leave. And we don't want to talk about leaving, so we don't want to talk about leaving a legacy. But the reality is that all of us will one day leave a legacy. And this morning, as we're talking about legacy, we're referring to your enduring influence that benefits others after you are gone. It's what people will remember about us. It's what determines how quickly we will be forgotten or how long we will be remembered. Our legacy determines what people will say about us when we're no longer here to defend ourselves. And in some ways, legacy is our opportunity to live beyond our lifetime. Not in a spiritual sense, but in a very practical sense. Our opportunity to impact the world even after we're no longer here. Now, we're very familiar with this concept, especially this weekend, because the often misquoted movie phrase, "Luke, I am your father." It's about legacy. And it generates all sorts of questions for decades of movie watchers. And it's generated decades of sequels for those of us who watch it as well. But it causes the viewer to ponder the legacy of Luke and to question the legacy of Darth Vader. And maybe if yesterday's mint juleps are a little bit more your speed, then you would know that Secretariat, the Triple Crown winner that passed in 1989, that Secretariat still holds the record. But speaking of legacy, you likely heard yesterday at least once that every horse in this year's Kentucky Derby was a descendant of Secretariat. That's quite a legacy. You see, legacy matters to every person in the room. It matters to us regardless of our faith background. It matters to us regardless of our upbringing, our heritage. It matters to us regardless of our stage of life. Because if we find ourselves younger, then those of us who are younger, we approach legacy and have the opportunity in a conversation like this to define, what do I want that legacy to look like one day? This is my chance with so many trends and so many voices and so many inputs that are telling me this is how you be a good mom. This is what a dad should do. All of those different competing interests, it gives me a chance to truly define my values, my goals, and to identify what is really going to matter way out there, hopefully in the future one day. For those of us who find ourselves in midlife, a conversation about legacy gives us an opportunity to evaluate. Because those of us in midlife, we find ourselves so busy managing life and managing family and managing business and managing opportunities. All of those different things consume our time and our energy and our effort. But a conversation like this gives us a chance to step back and to evaluate the trajectory that we are on. If I continue in my present path, what's the end result? To consider the trajectory, but also to make alterations if needed. And for those of us who would define ourselves as older, it gives us a chance to solidify our legacy, to intentionally live on purpose, to enrich those that are around us with everything that God's given us for as long as we're here. But we often tend to think of legacy as something that's built from the big moments in life. Those just big things that we plan, that we strategize for, that we lean into. That would be those enviable vacations, that huge surprise that you've planned, the key promotion that you've been working towards for so long, that big purchase that everybody's going to be talking about, the well-deserved recognition that you've finally earned, that amazing win that you've been practicing for, that stunning achievement. Or maybe it's the lasting inheritance that you leave for your children and your grandchildren. We think that legacy is made up of those big things. But over time, I've observed that legacy is rarely drawn from those big moments. Instead, it's written by the thread that strings all of those moments together. It's the everyday. It's the constant. It's the commonplace. It's who you are on Tuesday. And that's true of an unlikely hero that we find in the Old Testament. And as I say those words, Old Testament, if that's not familiar to you, it refers to the first half of our Bibles in which we find a narrative of God's relationship with the nation of Israel, his chosen people. And as I set the stage for where we're headed today, we find the main player to be 17 years old. His name is Joseph, familiar to many of us. And he is highly trusted as a teenager by his father, Jacob, sometimes referred to as Israel. But as we pick up the story, we find that Joseph is some unique blend of both confident and a little bit naive. Because Jacob says to Joseph, I want you to go and I want you to check in on your older brothers because they're watching all of our herds down in this other community, and I want you to go check in on them and bring me a report back. And so Joseph does. And Joseph, he does the right thing, and in doing so earns the respect of his father Jacob. But he brings back a negative report about his 10 older brothers. And that didn't land well, especially since Joseph was clearly the favorite out of all 12 of the siblings, his older brothers and his younger son, his younger brother Benjamin. So we pick up the story here. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. So everybody knows that Jacob loves Joseph, but Now Jacob's gone and kind of drawn attention to it. He's given him an ornate robe, or as some of us grew up, a coat of many colors, or elsewhere, an amazing Technicolor dream coat. But Jacob gives this to Joseph. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him. And they hated him so much that they could not speak a kind word to him. Have you ever found yourself there? I so despise that person that not only do I not want to be with them, but I don't know that I could wish them a good morning. I'm so frustrated right now. That's where his brothers were. They were so jealous and so resentful. And you would think that 17-year-old Joseph would know, hey, I probably need to lay low for just a little bit, need to let this kind of blow over, see if I can restore things. But no, Joseph begins to dream out loud. And he shares some prophetic dreams that he's been having with his brothers. And that didn't go so well. Because Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. It just intensified their frustration with him because he just kept talking about it. And Joseph moved into the dreamer stage of his life. Because as Joseph's talking out loud to his brothers, dreaming out loud, his dad's nearby, and he talks about this dream that he had where all of these sheaves of grain, in fact, there were 11 sheaves of grain, and Joseph's sheaf of grain was there in the middle, and all the 11 others, they were bowing down to Joseph's sheaf of grain. And everybody groans, and Joseph goes, no, wait, there's more. And he leans back in, and he said, I had a second dream. And in this one, there was a sun and a moon and a whole bunch of stars, and they were all bowing down to me. And at this point, Jacob, Joseph's father's like, Joseph, come on, man. Do you really believe that one day we're all going to bow down to you? That's crazy. Come on. His brothers storm off. They're angry, hateful. They head off to another pasture with the sheep. Some time passes, and Jacob challenges Joseph to go check up on his brothers yet again. And so Joseph does. And he heads down towards Shechem. Remember Shechem, because we're going to come back to that later. Heads down to Shechem, and he finds that his brothers have moved on from that field. They've found another pasture that was greener, and so he heads after them down to Dothan. And it's at that point that apparently Joseph, maybe he had kind of a unique way of walking or something, a strut that he had, but his brothers could see him way off in the distance, and they're like, oh man, here he comes. They saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Now you got to understand, this wasn't a rant. This isn't, oh man, I'm going to kill the guy. No, they had a strategy. They had a plan. They were going to kill Joseph. They said, here comes that dreamer. Come now, let's kill him. We're going to throw him into one of these wells, one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. And then we'll see. Then we'll see what comes of that guy's dreams. There's no way that we're going to let that guy be somebody we bow down to somewhere in the future. So as Joseph shows up, they grab him, and you can almost hear him struggle, going, hey guys, what are we doing? And they throw him in a well, and then they walk away, and he's like, all right, yeah, I get the message. Yeah, I know. I talked a little too much about those dreams. Guys! But they'd already moved off. They were some distance away. They were sitting down eating lunch together as Joseph is in the bottom of this well that he can't get out of. And the conversation begins. What are we going to do with him? How are we going to kill him? And then off in the distance, they see some Midianites, a crowd of people that They're clearly traveling, a caravan. And one of them says, hey, wait, what if instead of killing him, we'd feel kind of bad about that. So what if instead of killing him, we sell him to the Midianites? Then we'll get some money. We'll take that coat. We'll tear it up. We'll spill some animal blood on it. We'll take it back to Dad and just tell him, oh, we don't know what happened. I guess he got killed by some beast. And then we are done with Joseph. And so that was their plan. They drag him out of the pit. They sell him to the Midianites. They lie to Dad about what had happened to him. And Joseph travels with the Midianites the rest of the way to Egypt. And as he gets to Egypt, he's sold by the Midianites as a slave. And the highest bidder was a man named Potiphar. He was one of Pharaoh's officials. He was the captain of the guard. And at that point, Joseph becomes a slave. Now, this was no short stint as a slave. We find that he was a slave in Potiphar's house for some 11 years. Can you imagine how many times Joseph said, God, I thought this was a joke. I thought this was a prank. I thought this was an unfortunate reality. But is this my normal? Is this my current? Is this my life? For 11 years, he questioned what happened to his brothers and his father and his future. But along the way, Joseph gains influence. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in Potiphar's eyes, and he became his attendant. Even in a foreign country, even in a terrible situation, his heart became obvious to Potiphar, and Potiphar became trusting. So Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Joseph ran Potiphar's household. And we see that as Joseph steps into a really bad situation, he does the right thing, and once again, he's respected. Until things go badly. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome. Some of you struggle with this, and I wanted you to know there were others that felt the same thing you do. Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph refused. He refused to sleep with her. He refused to be with her. He ran from her. But in running from her on one occasion, he left his outer garment behind. And she grabbed it, frustrated that she had been rebuffed. And she made up a story that he had come on to her, and when she refused, he ran out, but he left his outer garment behind. And Joseph finds himself being treated wrongly for doing rightly. Has that ever happened to you? That's where Joseph found himself. And in the timeline of his life, he goes from being a slave to being a prisoner. But the story has a common refrain. Because now, once again, as a prisoner, he does the right thing. And what follows is respect. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. You see, Joseph understood that the Lord was with him. Sure, they're in the prison, but Joseph knew that the Lord had been with him way back in the pit, and then in Potiphar's house, and now he's with him again in the prison. And so Joseph steps up. So The warden put Joseph in charge of all of those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. Anything that happened in the prison was under Joseph's purview. Once again, his character is seen, and an opportunity is presented right there in front of him. And Joseph is in prison not for a moment. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was way more than that. He was in prison for 2 years until one day, Joseph is called by Pharaoh. Now, if you can put yourself in Joseph's mindset for just a second. You've been a slave in a foreign country for more than a decade. Now you've been wrongfully accused and you've been thrown in prison for a couple more years. And then you get word that Pharaoh wants to see you. In that moment, Joseph had to believe that he was facing certain death. And yet, he cleans up and he goes before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says to Joseph, hey, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now, this goes back to what was happened in the prison, because during some place in those 2 years, 2 men, 2 Egyptians, had been thrown into prison. And as they were thrown into prison, they had each had a dream. And they asked around the prison if anyone could answer their dream, explain their dream. And Joseph, through God's insight, leaned in and he described both of their dreams to them and gave them answers behind it. And in one case, as described, one of the men was taken out of prison and executed, and the other was taken out of prison and pardoned. And that guy was present when Pharaoh said, hey, I had a dream. Would somebody answer my dream? And he goes, oh my word, I remember a guy in prison. I was supposed to help him get out and I forgot. And so Pharaoh sends for Joseph. I've heard you can answer. And all of us would wish for Joseph in this moment that somehow he would bite his tongue. And yet he doesn't. You can interpret. And Joseph says, I cannot. And you're like, Joseph, what are you doing? This is Pharaoh. I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. It's not about me, Pharaoh. This is something that my God, who's been with me in every stage of my story, he can do that for you. Pharaoh said, look, it doesn't matter to me how I get the answer. I'm just looking for an answer. And so he begins to unpack his dream. There were 7 healthy cows, but they got devoured by 7 super thin cows. And Pharaoh says, I don't know what it means. But then I fell asleep again and I had another dream. And there were 7 full ears of grain. And they got swallowed up by these 7 blighted ears of grain. They were just scarce and sparse and corrupt, and somehow they ate the other years. What does it mean? Joseph says, it means that there's going to be 7 years of plenty in Egypt and the surrounding regions, and then there's going to be 7 years of famine. But instead of stopping there, Joseph continues, and he said there's more. Here's what I would suggest. Pharaoh didn't ask, but he volunteered. Here's what I would suggest. I would suggest you appoint a prime minister who oversees Egypt to address this famine. And then when it's time to hand out food, we would have different governors in different regions that would hand out the food to people. I think that's how you could be successful, Pharaoh. So then Pharaoh says to Joseph, since God has made this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. As I'm looking around the room here, I've told this dream now a few times, and none of my people could answer it. But because of God, you could answer it. So in my opinion, Pharaoh says, there's no one else as highly qualified as you. And once again, as Joseph does the right thing, Pharaoh extends respect. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. All of a sudden, this prime minister role is one that Joseph now owns. And he's not over just the grain. He's not over just the famine plan. He's over everything. Except, Pharaoh says, I'll still sit on the throne. I'll be the big dog. And in that moment, Joseph becomes the ruler. And Pharaoh gives him his ring so that he can seal contracts. He gives him the robe so that everyone will know from a distance that he is the prime minister. He's royalty. He's given the royal chain. He's given a chariot. And not only a chariot by which to arrive, but an announcer that would go ahead of him to let everyone know that the emissary of Pharaoh has arrived. And for 7 years, there is great prosperity across Egypt and the surrounding regions. And then the famine hits. And in that season, the Egyptians, they cried out. They had exhausted their food. Now they're starving. They're desperate for help. But not just the Egyptians. The world at large was crying out. Even Joseph's family, way back in Canaan. Jacob, Joseph's father, he says, look, I've already lost one son. So I'm going to hold on to my youngest, Benjamin. But the other 10 of you, I want you to go to Egypt because that's our only hope. And I've heard there's some sort of plan there where food is being handed out. So I want you to go to Egypt and beg for food. Now, Joseph was the governor of the land, the prime minister, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. You can imagine, for Joseph didn't notice at first because the room was full of groups that had come in begging, asking, negotiating. This was just one more group. So as Joseph turns around and he looks, he goes, oh my word, could that be? Moves to get a different look, a different position, their face still to the ground. He recognizes them. And I have to imagine that for Joseph in that moment, he recognized the fulfillment of that dream from so many years ago. And as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger, and he spoke harshly to them. He concealed his identity because he was testing his brothers. As they continued to negotiate, his brothers ended up buying some grain. They brought silver to purchase grain. But as they were trying to negotiate, Joseph said, I'm not going to give you all the grain you need because I think there's more to your family. And they said, well, yes, there's a brother back home. His name's Benjamin, but it would break Dad's heart for him to come, so he didn't come. And so Joseph says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to leave one of you behind. And I want you to go back and I want you to get Benjamin and bring him. And so as 9 of them now travel away, Joseph arranges for their silver to be put back into their grain bags. So as they begin on their journey, they get part way and they stop and they open for food and they find the silver in their grain bags and they become horrified. How did this get put back in here? All of our silver is back. And they're terrified that now they've robbed the rulers of Egypt. They hurry back to Jacob and they begin to tell him what's happened and how this has unfolded. And Jacob's distraught because one of the brothers is still in prison there in Egypt. And now they want Benjamin, the younger brother, and the food runs out. And Jacob acquiesces and they begin once again on the journey. And as they arrive back in Egypt, in front of Joseph once more, They return the silver. There's been some terrible mistake, but here's the first silver. And then we've come prepared to buy again. And here's our youngest brother. And Joseph then frames Benjamin, the youngest brother. He gives them grain, but as he sends them away, he puts the prized cup into Benjamin's bag. And when they find that, they turn around and they return it. They're distraught. And they say, take us, not Benjamin. And it's in that moment that Joseph, as he's interacted with them now these multiple times, realizes that the brothers are showing repentance, showing unity. And then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I am your brother, Joseph. And he adds this, the one you sold into slavery with Egypt. You can imagine the shock on their faces. And then the fear in their eyes. And ultimately the despair that swept over them as they realized they were likely done for. And now, Joseph says, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. God sent me. You had a plan, but God sent me for a purpose. And in that moment, Joseph became the forgiver. And Pharaoh finds out that his family's there, and he invites his entire family to move to Egypt. Once again, Joseph does the right thing, and he earns and garners respect. So Jacob and 66 of his dependents arrive in Egypt, and Egypt begins the process of famine so significantly that people are exhausted of their money, and then they begin to offer their flocks as payment, and then their land as payment. And after 17 years of living in Egypt, Jacob, Joseph's father, dies. And it's in that moment that his brothers become incredibly concerned. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if? What if Joseph holds a grudge against us? What if Joseph pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? And they send him a very nervous message. And we find that Joseph begins to weep. Because after nearly 20 years of doing life alongside his brothers were fearful that it was all an act. That it was just a show to appease dad. And now that dad is gone, maybe now he's going to get his retribution. His brothers come in front of him and say, look, we're your slaves. We're at your mercy. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Vengeance is God's. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Now, this is so easy to read. It is incredibly difficult to live. You meant evil, but God is writing a different story. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. Joseph says, I've been working a legacy since day one, all the way back in those fields, years and years and years and years ago. And I'm going to provide for you and for your children. And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. And once again, Joseph does the right thing, and his brothers respect him for it. And Joseph becomes a symbol. Because what we're told is that Joseph lives to be 110 years old. He sees his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. And even in the end, he offers hope for his family and confidence in the promise of God. Joseph says to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid. He says, this was never about me. I'm about to die, but God will come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham and to Isaac and to our dad, Jacob. I'm going to be gone, but God is the one who was always here. He was with me in the pit and in the prison and alongside Potiphar, and God will be with you now. And he will come to your aid, and more than that, he hasn't forgotten the promise he made. And even though we're in this foreign country, Egypt, one day he's going to take you into that promised land. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. As Joseph passed, his bones were placed in a coffin, and they resided there in Egypt for a season. But once Moses appeared on the scene and ultimately led the nation of Israel out of Egypt, they carried the bones of Joseph along with them. And as they entered the desert and began to question God and doubt, and God said, well, because of your lack of faith in me, in spite of all of this legacy, in spite of this story, you're now going to wander around in the desert for 40 years. For 40 years, they carried the bones of Joseph along with them. Can you imagine the number of times there was a conversation? What's in this box? Why are we carrying this? We have to pick this up again? And over and over and over and over and over again for 80 years. The story of Joseph as a dreamer, and then a slave, and then a prisoner, and then a ruler, and a forgiver, and a symbol was told. Countless times the story was told. Until one day, Joshua leads the nation of Israel into the promised land. And the bones of Joseph, the coffin of Joseph was taken, and it was buried at Shechem, that field that Joseph walked to check on his brothers. And for you and me, when we look at this timeline, as we see how this played out for Joseph, we recognize that legacy isn't a moment in time. Instead, it's a mile of thread that connects all of those moments together. Legacy is about ongoing impact of who you are and how you live. It's about how you treat people in the morning when you roll out of bed and that's not your best time, or in the evening where you're absolutely tired. It's about what you say to others, about how you listen to others, about how you handle your frustration, about how you invest in people, about how you leverage your time and your talent, how you express your gratitude, how you forgive your enemies, how you are generous with your resources, how you keep improving, and how you live out your values. That's what legacy is all about. And just like Joseph, you have a lifetime to curate your legacy. So, what does that look like? How do we do that? I think there's 5 things that we've got to include. The first is we have to chart your course. Chart your course, your destination. How do you want to be remembered? Because that factors in your uniqueness, your unique gifts, your unique passions, your unique abilities. How do you want to be remembered? What is your genius? But also, what are your values? Have you determined what matters most for your life, for how you want to be remembered? Stephen Covey says, begin with the end in mind. That's charting your course. But secondly, thread the moments. Thread the moments together. Recognize that how you live on Tuesday is just as important as that big thing that you're planning, that you hope everyone's going to come to and everyone's going to be a part of. The small moments are just as important as those big, big memories. Thread them together. Thirdly, invest yourself. Now, if we read that too quickly, we see invest in yourself. And we all do that pretty well. But invest yourself. Invest your time in people, because people will outlive you. They carry on after you're gone. Invest your time in people. Invest your money in movements. Movements that will last. Movements that make a kingdom impact. Movements that will last with an impact into eternity. Fourthly, course correct. As we read the Bible, we see over and over and over again that some really great people made some really, really dumb choices. But because of the mercy of our Heavenly Father, there is opportunity to redirect, to start again, to course correct. But we've got to be wise enough, sensitive enough to gauge our progress, to consider if the trajectory that we're on takes us to the destination that we intend. And lastly, we need to exaggerate the ending. I don't know too much about gymnastics, but anytime that I watch a gymnastics meet, especially in the Olympics, you see them do this incredible routine that requires all sorts of agility. And then at the very end, they stick the landing. And they do that in such a profound way that everybody knows that they've ended well. For each of us, we've got to exaggerate the ending. We've got to stick the landing. We have to avoid squandering through unkindness or unforgiveness or unmotivatedness as we move towards whatever life God has given to us. Now, this series, we selected it weeks ago, a couple months ago, that this is where we were heading, this conversation. But some of you know that several weeks ago, my father passed from this earth. And that's changed this whole conversation for me just a little bit. But my dad, on the week that he passed on Sunday, my dad was serving at his church on Sunday morning. And then during the week, one of the things that my dad did was vet volunteers for the Red Cross. And so Dad had papers around where he was vetting these volunteers during the week. And then on Wednesday, the day that he passed, that morning he met with friends, connected with some others later in the day. And then as he headed back to his place, he sat down and went to heaven. Now, for my family, as we've grieved his passing and as we've begun the process of sorting through his things, we came across a notebook. And in this notebook, my dad had written some steps. And this notebook dates back to when my dad was wrapping up his career. My dad spent his entire career, the majority of it, working alongside nonprofits in fundraising and development, helping whatever their mission was to be able to go further, faster, for them to accomplish more stuff. And as my dad was nearing retirement, he sat down with this notebook and he began to make a plan. And he etched out how he was going to spend his time. And my dad listed several nonprofits that he was going to investigate, whether he could serve alongside. The Red Cross was one of them. His church was one of them. There were several others. And as we looked back at the ending of my dad's life, my dad had lived out that plan, continuing to make a difference alongside so many different people. And so on the day that we held my father's service, there was a standing room only crowd for an 85-year-old man. And that crowd was made up of children and young couples, some seniors alongside him. It was made up of every age group. It was made up of people that he had known, some for just a few months and some for years. And it was made up of people that were in all different roles in his life. Some that he used to work alongside but had stayed in touch with. Some where he was living in his community as he had volunteered on one of those boards. Some in his church as they grabbed our hand and said, "Your dad said hey to me every single Sunday." And as we concluded my dad's service, I was reminded that we get to choose to live lives so that when we pass, that more people line up for our celebration than they do for our stuff. Tomorrow's big memories, they really do come from today's small moments. It's true for my dad. It's true for Joseph. And it's true for all of us as well. Heavenly Father, in some ways, I guess we should be grateful that it's not the big moments, because we'd always be questioning whether we had done them big enough, whether we had done enough of them. But God, it's the day-to-day. It's the way we choose to live today that affects the way we're remembered tomorrow. God, thank you that because of Jesus, our eternity isn't shaped like that. Because we all know we don't measure up. And we thank you for Jesus providing forgiveness so that our eternity can be secure. But God, our legacy lies within our hands. May we steward it. May we curate it well. I pray these things in Jesus' name.